Hey, everybody, I'm Matt Nannis, and this is the Daily Reflection Podcast. What ended up happening in active addiction and consumption is I did that at the detriment of everybody around me and myself. So when I find myself in a situation now in sobriety, in recovery, that does not require that skill set, which has become like quite literally as natural as a knee-jerk reaction, to pause and respond or pause and reflect, that's new practice for me.
Welcome to the Daily Reflection Podcast with your hosts Michael L. and Lee M. On this show, we try to provide some inspiration through interviews with members of the recovery community. We are not affiliated with any 12-step or recovery program, but you will hear them mentioned throughout the course of an interview. On today's show, Matt N. from Ashville, North Carolina. He's got a powerful story. Stay tuned for that. Before we get to the show, I'd like to ask a favor. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, one of the ways that you can help the show is by providing a rating and a review. Shows that receive consistently high ratings, like 5 stars, reach more listeners because they appear higher in the search results. And that's what we're trying to do, reach more and more potential alcoholics and addicts with the message of hope and inspiration. Your help is appreciated there. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Good morning, Lee. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing great, Mike. How are you this morning?
Fantastic. What's going on for April 6th?
So very excited this morning. We've got Matt Nannis in the studio with us, and he's from Ashville, North Carolina. And he's here to talk to us about the daily reflection for today, which is April 6th. And the title is A Lifetime Process.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Matt, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, Matt, we get started in the same way every day. We ask the guests to read the daily reflection, and then we have a chat about it. Would you help us get started and read the reflection?
Let's do it. Let's see. April 6th, a lifetime process. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 52. These words remind me that I have more problems than alcohol, that alcohol is only a symptom of a more pervasive disease. When I stopped drinking, I began a lifetime process of recovery from unruly emotions, painful relationships, and unmanageable situations. This process is too much for most of us without help from a higher power and our friends in the fellowship. When I began working the steps of AA program, many of these tangled threads unraveled, but little by little, the most broken places of my life straightened out. One day at a time, almost imperceptibly, I healed. Like a thermostat being turned down, my fears diminished. I began to experience moments of contentment. My emotions became less volatile. I am now once again a part of the human family.
Matt, first of all, let me ask you, what's your sobriety date?
June 8th, 2013.
So as you read this, how does this resonate for you?
What really resonates is the little by little thermostat analogy of fear diminishing, and having the experience of the gift of contentment and being in a system of support through sponsorship and fellowship where I get to become comfortable with that sense of contentment, because that I remember, and it still is a newer concept to me. It is an experience on a cellular level that ironically enough makes me a little uneasy, because I spent so much time well situated in chaos and wanting and needing and avoiding or escaping from that. To be content, to be is a new and alien experience, and sometimes it's still very jarring. When I'm in the midst of chaos, I can settle in a lot faster than when I'm in the midst of contentment. So that sentence, I think, actually is the talking point for me.
I get that. And, we talk to a whole lot of people in recovery, and you're not alone. I mean, I feel it too. I don't think you're alone. I definitely feel that same way. And, we talk to a lot of people in recovery, and you see so much of it. So many people in recovery are so uncomfortable with contentment and when things are going right. Why do you think that is?
I'm confident in my skill set to read a room, to take a temperature of the surroundings that I find myself in. It served me very well when I was actively using substances that controlled the way I thought and felt. And I've learned in recovery through sponsorship and fellowship that it is also a skill that I can refocus and retool and use for the betterment of the people about me. That being said, I have a lot more experience reading a room, assessing it as dangerous, and figuring out how I can manipulate the surroundings I find myself in so that I can protect myself. What ended up happening in active addiction and consumption is I did that at the detriment of everybody around me and myself. But there's a muscle memory there from being able to manipulate and take advantage of. That was the goal, whether it was stated or otherwise. That was the goal, because that got me to the end game, which was to get messed up, to be able to get the heck out of there mentally and spiritually and emotionally. So when I find myself in a situation now in sobriety, in recovery, that does not require that skill set, which has become like quite literally as natural as a knee-jerk reaction, to pause and respond or pause and reflect, that's new practice for me. To further be told by my sponsor and the people around me with more experience, more lived experience, to be told that in fact is where the juicy bits of life are. If I can just accept and let go and allow things to unfold the way that they're gonna play out anyway. My third step experience tells me to hip check myself the fuck out of the way so that life can do what life does. There's a reason that it was such a formal experience with my sponsor, that I took a knee, held his hand, and said those prayers together, because that is a shock to the system, the blueprint that I had prior to coming into recovery.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And, it is a lifetime process. You're talking about adaptive, I guess, reactions or instincts or adaptations from, I guess, growing up, early childhood, learning how to behave a certain way when we're out there drinking. Mike likes to call it character default. And, first comes awareness, I guess, that these things are even happening. And then how are we going to do things differently? And I love the way you described that process of how it started with your sponsor. And in here, it says, in the reflection, it says, when I stopped drinking, like the drinking isn't really the issue. It's this other stuff that we're talking about. When I stopped drinking, I began a lifetime process of recovery from unruly emotions, painful relationships, and unmanageable situations. And it talks about needing the help. I hear you saying you needed the help from your sponsor. And this also says that you needed the help of a higher power. And my question to you is, how did that unfold for you, the whole higher power thing?
I've been curious about that, because the further away from the last drink that I had, the more reflection plays into answering questions like that, right? And I can't really, I think, accurately tell you 3 months in, 3 weeks in, like what switched. I know that, that when I talk about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now, I know the middle part, what happened. I know that it happened. I find it more and more, I find it increasingly challenging to articulate what happened. So what I've boiled it down to in reflecting on that, how that came to be in my life and in my recovery, was an incremental trust that I placed and faith that I placed in little more than my sponsor. This man told me, stripped down version, as fundamental, as black and white, as like binary as possible, how he was prior to reading the same book of Alcoholics Anonymous, how he lived his life prior to reading that book with Chris. He read that book with Chris, and how he lives his life and experiences life having read that book with Chris. And I pressed him on it pretty extensively. And the only thing that we could come down for absolute certain was he read this book with a man who had read this book. And I was like, I can do, that I can commit to. I don't know about any of the other stuff that y'all are talking about I was in rehab at the time, any of the stuff you're talking about in the groups, any of the stuff that the therapists are talking about, any of these pages with different smiley and frowny faces that I'm supposed to color in because that's what I relate to in any given moment. None of that I could connect with. It was all like a dog and pony show. I thought it was a crack, but I could not deny, and I tried to, I could not deny that Ron was walking through this life differently than I was walking through this life. And the only thing he told me that he did was read this book with Chris. And I wanted to know, like, what book exactly. And he didn't pick up anything other than the same book that they handed me when I walked into rehab. And I was like, this book, like, this is the textbook. And he was like, this is a design for living. This is the roadmap through life, not to sidestep the situations as they come up, not to take shortcuts through. This is the roadmap. And it's going to address everything that's going to come up for the rest of your life, because that's what my experience was. So, you ask me how that higher power experience developed and evolved. I can tell you that it evolved slowly. I can tell you that it happened. I read the book with Ron because Ron read the book with Chris. I had questions and curiosities about the content of the book, and I would ask Ron regularly, but what else did you do? Like, people are talking about praying, people are talking about meditation, like, what else did you do? And he was like, there's, as a result of this, that, and the other, more things opened up for me. The only thing that definitively that I can relay to you is that I read this book with Chris. And I don't know that I had any degree of trust in the recovery, the rehab that I was in. I don't know that I had any degree of trust in my therapist, my group therapist who was assigned to me. And I definitely wasn't engaged in any active listening in any of the meetings that I didn't choose to go to. I had to get on the van to get dropped off at a meeting, or else they wrote me up. Right. So it was me learning a system. I learned how to do rehab, just like I learned how to do school. If I did this and went to this class and didn't buck against the system when they took me to an AA meeting, I got to get out of group early and I could get first dibs on the sun chips or whatever the hell it was. But I couldn't figure out Ron's agenda. And it didn't seem to be anything other than, if I came to him and asked him what he did, he told me that he read a book with Chris. That was the extent of it. As a result of reading the same book with Ron that he read with Chris, I turn the page and suddenly there's a third step prayer. He doesn't tell me to pray and meditate in the morning. He tells me to sit quietly, to get up an extra 10 minutes early so that I can carve out 5 minutes just to sit quietly, because my roommate is this, that, and the other, and the day is going to be tough. He never says the word prayer, never says the word meditation. He just tells me to sit down and to set my alarm on my watch, because otherwise I'll be checking it every 5 seconds. My grandfather, my mother's father, actually passed away about 3.5 weeks into rehab. I was in for 90 days. And I had been doing this sit quiet thing for 5 minutes. He actually told me to set my watch for 6 minutes because he knew it would take me a minute to settle. And at the end of that, I'm supposed to let the thoughts come in and let the thoughts come out. I don't know what the fuck that means, but I believe Ron for whatever reason. So I'll do what he's telling me to do. And at the end of that specific 6 minutes, to nobody in particular, I say, help my mom get through today. I say it out loud. And I don't have any idea who I'm talking to. I don't know where that came from, but I know that something just happened. And I have no idea what it is, but enough that when I get to clinical, I find Ron and I'm like, I just fucking talked to my living room to help my mom. Matter of fact, he was like, oh, it sounds like somebody had a second step experience. I didn't even know what the fuck that meant. But I could see that he had it was this weird, like, prideful, not even, he was just happy for my experience, happy that I had one. So I go around telling everybody I just had a second step experience without any clue what it is that meant. But again, another testament to me trusting Ron. Ron said I had a second step experience. I must have had a second step. And if the second step experience is pivotal and evolving into a third step experience, which is the process of turning my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand him, I guess I'm halfway to a third step experience. And it must have been genuine, because based on the shit that came up when I did my fourth step, I must have been willing to an impressive degree to turn my will and my life over to something that I did or didn't understand, because if not, I wouldn't have finished my fourth step. So scaffolding, I don't know, maybe he was a teacher in another life, or maybe he just did what I asked someone to help me do in my own third step, and he just stayed the fuck out of the way, and we read a book and let what happens happen.
I'm dying to know how you met Ron. And I want to hear a little bit about what gave you the willingness to do these things and actually want to sit quietly and want to read the book.
I was intervened upon. As far as I knew, I was on my way to a wedding in upstate New York for a weekend. 15 of my closest friends. I was setting something up to buy some supplies so that I could make it through said weekend in upstate New York. For some reason, everyone was going to caravan from outside of my apartment at the time, outside of, I lived about 1.5 miles from Fenway Park in Brookline in Coolidge Corner. I was intervened upon. I had an intervention, and I was terrified of. I don't know if anyone knows what an impact letter is, but the end of an impact letter is the consequence. So here's the boundary. Here's what you've done, how it's impacted me. Here's my request for you or my hope for you. And if you don't do this, and then there's the consequence. And I stood up after the first impact letter was read prior to the consequences. Not because I was brave, not because they were right, not because someone finally saw that I was hurting inside. I didn't want to fucking hear any more impact letters. It was terrifying in front of 14 people, and my parents were there. My brother from DC was there. It was an awful experience. But I got on a plane and I went down to Florida, and I had spent about 2.5 weeks. I actually probably spent half a day reading the room, being like, this is what rehab is. I get it. I mean, this sucks and this is a nightmare, but 90 days, if I do this, that, and the other, I can get through each day fast. That'll add up 90 of those in a row and I'll go home and I can go back. And about 2 weeks in, there was every Friday we did, what was it? It was kind of like the impact letters. We would, I can't remember the name of what the class was, but we would call out people's behavior because it was having a negative impact on our recovery, or we would give affirmations. And it was very detailed and scripted because there were like 120 of us in the cohort, and things could escalate pretty quickly if you didn't use the specific languaging. It escalated quickly anyway. But anyway, I had learned that I could skip most of these by going to my therapist and pretending I was upset, which ironically I was. I just didn't know that. She wouldn't let me skip this one. And one of the guys in my group therapy kind of elbowed me. It was the only seat left because I was late because I was trying to skip it. And he kept elbowing me to share. Ivan was his name. Ivan didn't have a drinking problem. He was just there for his 5th or 6th DUI. He kept elbowing me and he was like, you have something to share. I was like, the hell I do. And he wouldn't let it go. And he was a big dude. So like I felt it every time he elbowed me. And the last time I was like, dude, Ivan, like, I'm good. We got 15 minutes. We can run this out, go get apples. We can get driven back to where we live. And Ivan was like, all right. And Ivan raises his hand. I was like, fine, you fill the 15 minutes. I don't even care. And he raises his hand. They call on Ivan, and Ivan goes, Matt's got something to say. And I was like, dude, I don't. And he's like, I'm pretty sure you do. So for whatever reason, I stood up and I introduced myself at the time. So the thing that got me into recovery super fast, into rehab super fast, were substances other than alcohol. So at the time, part of that meant that I identified if I was forced to as an addict, because at the time I thought they were very, very different. There was a whole caricature of one and caricature of the other. So I stood up and I introduced myself as Matt, and I'm an addict. I had never said that before, ever. I was 33 and I had spent about 18 and a half to 19 years, more or less being one, but I had never identified as one. And the next thing that came out of my mouth was, and I'm getting in the way of my own recovery. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And for some reason, I didn't stop talking then. And I basically got vulnerable in front of 120 people and told them what I had thought about them for the last 2 weeks, which is ill-advised. And I think they actually wrapped up the group earlier than normal because I was telling 100 some odd people that they were junkies and addicts and they really needed to be there. I wasn't trying to attack them. I was trying to explain the perspective that I had been carrying for 2 weeks. And that was it. We finished. We called it early. I grabbed an apple, got on the van, went back. And when I woke up, it was like the Wizard of Oz shit where she takes off in black and white and lands in Technicolor. I mean, the same shitty 15-passenger van, the same program, the same groups, the same damn people, but it was different. I was experiencing the same thing that I did yesterday differently. I felt as if people were around me were changing immediately within 2 or 3 days. And they weren't. They were the same pain in the ass, scared, this, that, and the other that they were on Friday afternoon. But I was experiencing them differently. So eventually I got to know Ron from when he covered some of our classes. He worked the adolescent program. So he worked with like 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. And I was in the young adult program. And even at 33, we did a parents' weekend. And something happened during the parents' weekend this is when I found out that all he did was read the book with Chris. My parents came down and it was gut-wrenching and a lot of healing. And my dad, who is a retired accountant, pulled Ron aside and said, like, I'm an accountant, which is how he qualifies everything he says. If you give me a book, if you can tell me that there's a book, an instruction manual on how to understand what my son is going through, I will read it, but I don't know how else to relate to him. And Ron was like, you just need the book? He's like, that's all I'm looking for. I know it's a silly request. And he was like, hold up, I'll be back in 10 minutes. And he just leaves as if he's going to get a book. And I follow him out into the hallway and I'm like, there's a fucking book? What am I doing here? There's a book? And he's like, yeah, they gave it to you when you got here. Let me just go grab it for your dad. And he comes back with the big book. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I couldn't wrap my head around it. He gives it to my dad. My dad still has it. He slid his business card into the front of it. He's like, if you have any questions about anything you're reading, give me a call day or night. I'm happy to help. We had a break. It was a cigarette break. And Ron was out there smoking a cigarette. And I walked up to him with the intention of asking him if he was willing to be my sponsor. And I did that 4 times over the parents' weekend. The 4th time, each time I asked him for a cigarette instead of asking him to be my sponsor. The 4th time, I finally, for whatever reason, again, just asked him to be my sponsor. We're not really supposed to do that. You're only here for 28 days. I was like, I'm here for 90. I signed myself unknowingly in for 90 days. And he was like, oh, why don't you bring that book to my office Monday morning? And that was it.
I love that story on so many levels. It's funny too, how just how things unfold. Everything just kind of always unfolds how it's supposed to for your greater good. And here's Ron, like probably showing up to teach a class. And next thing you know, he's become one of the most important people in your recovery. I think that's cool how that works. So here in the book, it says, little by little, the most broken places of my life straightened out. One day at a time, almost imperceptibly, I healed. Like a thermostat being turned down, my fears diminished. I began to experience moments of contentment. My emotions became less volatile, and I'm now once again part of the human family. I'm wondering if you can share with us that process of healing for you. Was it of the educational variety, or did it happen for you rather quickly?
So it was absolutely of the educational variety. It's funny, my sponsor now that I'm been in Asheville for a while, I called Ron and like quote unquote broke up with him. And it was very challenging for me. He didn't really give a shit. Compassionately, he didn't really give a shit. I just wanted to sit across the table from somebody. That was all. Have a coffee, not be on Skype. I did that for the first couple of years moving here. But my current sponsor talks about the burning bush or educational variety, and he likes to read. He likes to research origin stories, and he's like, I read, if you read the burning bush story in the Bible, he comes across he walks over and he was just murdered 2 people, and he comes across this bush, a flame, but it's not consuming the bush, and the voice of God talks to him, and he tells him his charge and what he's going to do, and his immediate response is, "You got the wrong guy." So I think about that all the time when I'm talking to sponsees about their disappointment or angst or anticipation of this burning bush. They think it'll be a light switch, because in the rooms, people talk about that switch all the time. And I think about it that I can see this, I can see what I perceive to be the switch taking effect in your life, but I rarely see it in myself. So my experience with the educational variety, I liken to when I was withdrawing. When I was going through the process of physical and chemical withdrawal from everything that I put in my body for so many years, there were countless restless nights of sleep. And I wouldn't even be able to tell you how many hours I slept. And it wasn't as if one day I woke up and I was like, damn, that was a full night's sleep. What happened was 3.5 weeks into being in rehab, it occurred to me that the last week and a half I'd been sleeping pretty good. And I think similarly, it occurs to me for whatever reason and after whatever duration, I haven't been as much of a dick to this person or that person or the other over the last couple of things, or like a very like amplified event, specific event would occur and I would walk through it. And then somewhere along the lines, often when someone would come back up to me and be like, hey, I really appreciate the way that you handled that. Because it's always that I still want that affirmation. I am still an alcoholic. I still want that validation and affirmation. I just choose different methods to acquire it these days. And I'm willing and able these days, because of recovery, to give it to myself, which is a beautiful new source of affirmation and validation. But when I hear that from another human being, inside or outside of recovery, we're all healing from something. Then I'm able to reflect and say, you know what? Yeah, I appreciate that I handled it that way. I could have blown this person up, blown up our friendship and relationship. Any possibilities, the way you talk about things just unfolding and letting them happen, I think about it all the time. Sometimes it comes up in work, sometimes it comes up in sponsorship or fellowship. Sometimes I just say it because I get socially awkward in situations and I don't know what else to say, but I'm always down to have a cup of coffee and a conversation with somebody because I genuinely, authentically never have any fucking clue what's going to happen as a result of that communication. And if I can tap into some degree of authenticity, which is really just like this minute degree more than it was, however many years ago, but it's more than it was, and that's enough. If I can authentically connect to somebody, if I can listen to them speak, not wait for my turn to talk, if I can look them in the eyes, some of that fifth step promises stuff, shoulder to shoulder, look at the world in the eye, I get to stay open to all the maybes, all the what ifs. And there's still some terrifying what ifs and maybes in there. And I've experienced an outrageous number in such a short time of really amazing, unforeseen, awesome maybes and what ifs. I just got to show up.
Thinking about how this program, I mean, it's a design for living. And as we continue to work it, we kind of strip away all the bullshit, all of the protection mechanisms and the character defaults that don't serve us. What advice do you have for somebody that might be just trying to wrap their head around an addiction problem or just can't seem to figure out how to drink like a normal person?
So I'm not a book quoter, largely because of how long I got messed up. I don't have the memory that I once did, but I do know that on page 47, it's in the context of, it's in We Agnostics, and it's in the context of wrapping my head around religious concepts, spiritual concepts. And on 47 at the top, it's my favorite. It's my absolute favorite. It's just for a little context, I'll read more of it. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies to other spiritual expressions, which you find in this book. This is the best sentence ever in how I live my life today. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. And I say that as an answer to your question as far as advice, because I once thought I engaged in this process to get sober. I once thought I engaged in this process to do this, that, and the other, so that I could achieve this, that, and the other. And the longer I stick with this program, one day at a time, sponsor people, talk to my sponsor, go to meetings, and engage in service work, all those qualifiers and clauses of this unofficial contract I signed, they strip away, they go away. And the only thing I'm asked for now with my current sponsor, the only thing he tells me to do, I don't even know if that's accurate. The only thing that he hopes I do is engage in the process. It's all I got to do. When I used to go out drinking, it wasn't necessarily to fuck up my life and the lives of the people about me, but that shit rippled out to the shore of my life. Similarly, dropping that pebble of engagement in recovery, if I continue to drop that one pebble of just engaging today, that shit, the positive, the good, juicy stuff, that ripples out to the shores too. So what advice do I have is I say this to sponsees all the time, like, come at me with all of your angst, all of your anger, give it to me. What pisses you off? Because if it pisses you off, then it's striking a nerve. Let's maybe get through the anger that's behind it. And let's just talk about what it is that pisses you off about it. Let's just have a conversation. Show me as much of you as you're willing to show me. And I guarantee you, I'll come back tomorrow and we can talk about it again. You talk about showing up, like, Youre did a class in my rehab, and I don't even know what the topic was. I know he told us his sobriety date every time before we started. And every day I walked in the room, he put his hand on my shoulder and introduced himself to me as if I had never met him before. I was like, Youre, I was here yesterday. But he puts his hand on everyone's shoulder and he says, my name's Youre A. My sobriety date is such and such. God willing, I'll get through tomorrow, or I'll get through today, and tomorrow I'll have one more day of sobriety. I know you're hurting. Even if you don't, pick up a chair. Let's just talk for an hour, see what happens. I couldn't tell you anything about Youre except that he said that shit every fucking time I stepped into his class for 90 days. And every time I didn't think it was templated. Every time I thought he was genuinely seeing me and saying hi to me and welcoming me. Put your shit down in the corner. Nobody's going to fuck with it. They got enough worries of their own. At the end of the day, if you want to take it back with you, you're more than welcome to, but you don't have to.
I love what you read too. And it's funny because when I got in, I have that highlighted, underlined and all that too. It's one of my favorite parts of the big book, but it's like we weren't really encouraged out in the world to do too much contemplation and asking ourselves what things mean to us, and to be able to come into a program that is a program that invites us to think about what things mean to ourselves is so empowering and beautiful. It means that it gets to unfold for me, maybe differently than it unfolds for you and Mike. And it's beautiful. So what a beautiful share today, Matt. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, is there any final thought as we begin to wrap up that you'd like our audience to hear?
I think in hearing your reflection just then, what comes up to me is another thing that my sponsor says to me about the tone of this program as he perceives it, and I've come to perceive it, and that the ball is always in my court. It's always on me, and that at one time was really daunting and overwhelming and scary. It felt like pressure. And through consistent engagement, drop that pebble in the pond. Through consistent engagement, nothing more, just reading a book with a guy who had read the same book before with a guy who had read the same book. That thought that the ball is in my court is so motivating and empowering. And it brings this sense of calm and ease that I can't possibly articulate to anyone who has not experienced that sense of calm and ease, except to promise that it is the result of the work. And all those cliches, again, that page 47 quote, ask yourself, if you can, when you're ready, why it is that you buck against them to the degree that you do.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your experience, strength, and hope. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you having me.
Yep. Thanks for coming. So good.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks so much to Matt for stopping by, and thanks to you, the listeners. Appreciate your support. If you want to find us online, you can join us on Facebook. We've got a Facebook group that's growing. You can find it at facebook.com/groups/Daily Reflection Podcast. That's all one word, lowercase. Should be easy to find. You can read about recovery on our blog at blog.dailyreflectionpodcast.com. And you can find us on Twitter @DailyReflector. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.